Hi guys, so bit of a different one today. As some of you may know, my computer growing up was the Commodore 64 and I had that for about 5 years until I got my Amiga 500 in '93. So I had a Commodore and my friend Martin had a Spectrum. Now, I hated the Spectrum. Why? Well, I didn't like the monochrome graphics. So he didn't like the Commodore 64. His argument was big blocky graphics, and we used to bicker like mad. I remember one time in a science class we were both bitching at each other about the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum and which was better. And a lad on the next table said, "Will you guys shut up, you sound like an old couple." Anyway, fast forward 30 years and I finally bite the bullet and buy a Spectrum. Now this one had never been used. It was new old stock and I was the first person ever to use it. So the box was a bit battered, but the actual computer itself was in mint condition. It was still in the plastic bag. The plug hadn't even been wired on. It even smelt new. Now, I don't know if you ever smell your consoles and computers, but because this was new old stock, I had to. You know that new plastic smell? It had that. And I've got to admit, there are some games on the Spectrum that I prefer to the Commodore 64 counterparts. Anyway, so here are 10 games that I think are better on the Spectrum than on the Commodore 64. So, we start off the countdown with this classic side-scrolling shoot-'em-up from Hewson, Synapse. Now, here is a perfect example of graphics don't maketh the game. So even though the Commodore 64 version has nice detailed terrain, a parallax starfield and animated sprites, the gameplay lets it down. First of all, there are no checkpoints halfway through the level, so if you die, you have to start again at the beginning. Secondly, your spacecraft feels a bit floaty, and the controls don't feel very precise. And it also doesn't help that your ship has inertia. All in all, the C64 Synapse is a frustrating but challenging affair, but still worth a blast every now and again. Now onto the Spectrum version, and looks aren't everything. The game plays very smoothly, the scrolling is excellent, and I found it a lot easier to control over the C64 version. The gameplay is very addictive, and I found myself playing this a lot longer than I should have done, whereas the C64 version, I turned it off after a couple of attempts. At number 9 is the follow-up to Ocean's smash hit Operation Wolf, Operation Thunderbolt. Now, some of you may know the story behind the Commodore 64 version of Thunderbolt and why it was a below par conversion of Tato's
classic shooter. Here's the reason in a nutshell. The original coda was let go by Ocean for taking too long, and as the deadline loomed ever closer, the remaining C64 programmers had, wait for it, 12 days to finish the project before the master tapes were taken to the duplicators. The first thing you'll notice about this version is the lack of enemies on screen at any one time, and this is due in part to the C64 struggling with sprite scaling. If we look at the second level, there's more enemies on screen, and that's down to the horizontal side-scrolling stages not needing the sprite scaling. But considering what the team at Ocean pulled off in just 12 days wasn't all that bad, and was a valiant effort, and if given an adequate time frame it would have been great. Now with that in mind, let's take a look at the Spectrum version. And straight away you can see the amount of enemies on screen for relentless shooting action. And I think I would have gotten a lot further into the game had I not been playing on my own, as it appeared this many enemies would have been better suited for a two-player game. I was blown away at how good this looked and how it played. And I also wanted to check out the 48K version, and aside from the beeper rendition of the Operation Thunderbolt theme, the game itself is pretty much the same. The only downside to this and the other ports of the game is the lack of a crosshair, and I learned that this is because in the arcade version there's no crosshair, as you're using the mounted Uzis, and you can pick up a laser sight in game to assist you with your aim. Now Taito wanted this feature translated to the home ports, and were adamant that no crosshair be included. Crosshair or not, this is one of the best arcade home ports I've played on the ZX Spectrum. So for number 8, I've chosen The Empire Strikes Back, and as you can probably tell, there's no music in the Commodore 64 version, and the vector lines, the lines that make up all the sprites and objects in the game, are quite dull in comparison to the Spectrum version, which are very bright and vivid, just like the vector graphics in the original arcade game. And here is the Spectrum version, and as you can hear, there's music in game, and just like the arcade version, there's a different piece of music for each of the 4 stages. So you have the main Star Wars theme on stage 1, where you're battling the probe droids. Then there's the Imperial March for Stage 2 with the AT-ATs and Scout Walkers. On Stage 3, there's the piece of music Hyperspace for when you're fighting the TIE fighters. And finally on Stage 4, you've got the music from the asteroid field. Also, at the top of the screen you'll notice quotes as said by C3PO and Han Solo, which are absent from the Commodore 64 version. So, the Spectrum version of Empire Strikes Back for me is closer to the arcade version than any other format. Number 7 is Navy Seals, and I think the only real reason this is better on the Spectrum is that it just plays better. And although you have more colour on the Commodore versus the monochrome of the Spectrum, the sprites are a lot better animated on the Speccy. Now, there's no music in game, but it doesn't prevent this from being an impressive port. Also, I believe this is the only version of Navy Seals that allows you to load the main game or the last level first, as it's the only version that was released on cassette. The Commodore 64 and Amstrad versions were on cartridge, and Amiga and Atari ST were on floppy disks. Next up is WEC Le Mans. Now, the Commodore 64 version looks very sparse, with very little scenery at the side of the road, bar a few lampposts and directional arrows and the odd tree. There's no indication of what gear you're in, and the controls are extremely sensitive. I mean, you just need to tap left or right, and you just end up all over the road. So here's the Spectrum version, and as you can see there's a wealth of roadside objects, trees, Konami sponsors, and even an advertisement for spark plugs. There's a gear shift indicator in the bottom left corner letting you know whether you're in low or high gear, and there's some sort of indicator in the bottom right, and I think it's showing how much you're steering so you don't oversteer on the corners. But as far as gameplay, this feels so much more responsive and faster than the C64 version, and is a joy to play, and feels less like a chore. Number 5 is Shadow Warriors, aka Ninja Gaiden. Now, I had this 30 odd years ago and I wasn't its biggest fan. In fact, I didn't even like the arcade version. It's just very slow paced with sluggish controls. I mean, you play as a ninja. You should have lightning fast moves, but in this game, the character is more akin to a sloth. The hit detection on the Commodore 64 is virtually non-existent and is painful to play. And here is Shadow Warriors on the Spectrum. Massive sprites, much faster gameplay, beautiful colour graphics, and look! No colour clash! Much more playable. So, on the Commodore 64 and arcade, I'm lucky if I reach level 2. On this, I managed to get to level 3, which I've never done on any version of Shadow Warriors. Now, I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but I prefer this version to the arcade original. And the number 4 spot goes to Target Renegade. Now, this is one of the games that me and my friend Martin used to play on his Spectrum. So, the Commodore 64 version is only a one-player game, which is a shame as this would have been an excellent two-player game. The Spectrum and the Amstrad versions of Target Renegade are 2 players, so I'm not sure why the C64 wasn't. And here's the Spectrum version, and like a lot of games on this list, it does play a lot better than the Commodore 64 version. So Target Renegade on the Commodore 64 may look nicer, it does play better on the Spectrum. And me and my mate used to play this for hours, with me on a joystick and him on keyboard. Great memories. Number 3 is Batman the Movie, and I played this a hell of a lot back in the day. Now, on the Commodore 64, if you look at the Batman sprite, how detailed it is, a lot of effort has been put into it to make it look like Batman from the film. But if you look at the bad guys and the cop sprites, not much work has been put into those. They're just very basic blocky sprites. The guys on the platforms are just running left and right, firing aimlessly, hoping you'll get in their way. And then you've got the guys lobbing the grenades who are just pinned to the spot, constantly throwing grenades. Then, if we look at the Spectrum version, the bad guys are actively looking for you, much like on all other versions of this game. So they'll climb down ladders and back up again to try and reach you. Even the guys with the grenades are pacing up and down as well, and they only throw grenades if you get near them. Another plus for the Spectrum version is on the Carnival level, and just like on the Amstrad version, not only do you have to release the balloons, but at various points throughout the level you've got the Joker's helicopters to contend with as well. So, RoboCop just missed out on the number 1 spot. And as you can see on the Commodore 64 version, RoboCop can jump. Now, I know he can jump in the arcade version, but in the Spectrum and Amstrad ports, he doesn't jump. There's no reason for him to jump. Well, at least in the 8-bit ports anyway. In the C64 version, you just have the 1 life as indicated by the power bar in the top right. On the Spectrum, you have 3 lives, and if you die, you just go back to the start of your current level. But on the C64, once your power meter gets to 0, it's game over. The C64 RoboCop was released even though it was unfinished. So the level where you're in OCP was incomplete and just pixelated and completely unplayable. So to prevent gamers from seeing this, Ocean reduced the timer on the warehouse level, so that was impossible to beat. But there is a glitch in that level that allows you to walk through a wall, finish the level and finally see the garbled mess that is OCP headquarters. The Spectrum version of RoboCop is the only one I've actually completed of the home releases. In the Spectrum version you can also see how many bullets for each weapon you have remaining, and if you run out of bullets you have to use your fists until you can pick up more. So that was Robocop at number 2. But 35 years ago, it was at number 1 on the Spectrum charts for a whopping 18 months. Eat your heart out, Bryan Adams. So, the number 1 game that I think is better on the Spectrum than the Commodore 64 is, of course, Chase HQ. Now, I got this on the Commodore for Christmas in 1989, and I thought it was a complete joke. In fact, I'm still waiting for the punchline 34 years later. It almost resembles a Spectrum port, only the Spectrum version is miles better. It's extremely slow, whereas all other versions have a sense of speed, the sound effects are grating, and the music's horrendous. This is a prime example of what happens when a game is rushed to get it into the shops in time for Christmas. So let's check out the Spectrum version. And right off the bat, you can see this is leaps and bounds better than the Commodore 64 version. And this is just the title screen. And just like in the arcade game, there's the animated Chase HQ logo with all the letters bouncing around the screen. With a total of 5 different animations. Really nicely done. The 128K version has digitised speech and sound from the arcade version, such as "Let's go, Mr. Driver. Hold on, man." And you hear Nancy say, "The time's up," when the time reaches 0. And it's not just the presentation that's great, the game itself is so much better than the C64. Faster, better handling, more responsive controls. I'd happily play this any day over the Commodore version. Even on the back cover of the Hit Squad re-release of Chase HQ, all of the screenshots are of the Specky version, and I think that speaks volumes.
So there we go. Chase HQ on the Spectrum is miles better than the one on the Commodore 64. So what do you think? Is there any other games I should have added to the list? I know Old Style Gaming said Enduro Racer and Super Hang-On. I do agree with him, but I didn't want to add them to the list because I didn't have those games back in the day on the Commodore 64. So I wanted to choose games that I knew and loved on the Commodore 64 like 30 years ago that I think are better on the Spectrum today, if that makes sense. So anyway, thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, bye!